This oral history of museum computing is provided by Megan Forbes and was recorded on the 8th of March 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
So I started working in museums in 2005. I had just graduated from library school, so I abandoned the corporate world. I worked for Martha Stewart, um, fled that life in New York, went to graduate school for library and information studies. I assumed I wanted to be a librarian. Um, and then while in library school, I was working I went to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I was working at the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research in their film archives, was my practicum in library school, and really enjoyed sort of non-traditional librarianship. So ended up sort of focusing on that then in library school, special libraries and knowledge management and film. And so then when I left library school, I ended up actually never working in a library. I've still never worked in a library. And getting a job at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City. So it's a museum in Astoria, Queens. And contrary to its name, they don't actually collect film, which I probably thought when I applied there, given my film experience. It's a material culture collection. So they collect the material culture of film, television, and digital media. So movie cameras and action figures and costumes and scripts and all that kind of thing. Um, so when I started there, they were hiring just for a cataloger. And so I'd been a cataloger at the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research and figured, yes, this is a thing I know how to do, be a film cataloger. That's not really what they were hiring for, right? I started there, and on my first day, I sat down at my desk in my little cube, and they put a copy of a grant application on my desk, and it had a sticky note on top with a phone number on it. And they said, "This is a grant application. This is a funded grant that we wrote to the IMLS to develop a collections management system. And here is the phone number of the developer that we are working with." Here you go. So I thought I was applying for this cataloging job where I was going to be cataloging films. And then on my first day, they said, "Oh, and also, you're not cataloging films, by the way. And also, we need you to develop a collections management system. Here's the developer's phone number." So I had never used a museum collections management system. I had never worked in a museum before, so that was a surprise. Um, the first thing I had to do was honestly just read the grant application and see, like, okay, like what really did they tell the IMLS that they were going to do? And so they had been working with this software developer who had been working on a number of open source tools for museum collections management. And the goal of this grant was basically to take all of this work that he'd been doing, um, and kind of put it all together into one cohesive system. And then also catalog and digitize some of the museum's collection as a way to sort of put this new system through its paces. Um, so really quickly, I had to figure out what a museum collections management system was, why people would want one. I also really quickly had to learn about software development. He was a developer. He was probably more in tune with museums than any other developer I've ever worked with. Um, but he still, he wasn't working in a museum. And so really quickly just needing to get up to speed with, how do you develop software and how do you do functional requirements and what are the standards, that we want this thing to follow. At that time, Moving Image just had an access database that they were using. So it was really kind of loosey goosey, honestly, sort of how they were, describing and describing the collection. Um, so it was this really sort of fun and interesting challenge, obviously. A big part of it for Moving Image was that um, they had tried to find a proprietary system. to manage their collection. So another one of the things that was sort of put on my desk was, here's the banker's box with all of the proposals from all of the proprietary systems. They had hired a consultant to help them with this search. Um, and basically, the consultant came back and said, I have to be honest, none of the proprietary systems really work for your collection. A lot of them presume that you have an art collection or that you have an anthropology collection or that you have, your botanical garden, whatever it is. But because Moving Image was kind of this kooky collection where everything in the collection they had because of its relationship with something that wasn't in the collection. So, like, you have the Luke Skywalker action figure because it's related to Star Wars the movie, which is a thing they didn't actually have. And so then how do you catalog Luke, right? It's who's the artist for this action figure? And how do we capture all of those other relationships around things like licensing and distribution and manufacturing? So because of the nature of the collection, it just sort of really turned into this, the proprietaries are not, they don't really fit. And also you can't afford them. So that was a huge part of it. That, I think Moving Images in that really interesting. They're a mid-sized museum. So you sort of look at the numbers on paper and you think like, well, you should be able to afford a system. But, at the end of the day, a couple $1 million annual budget doesn't really go very far all of a sudden when you have to pay salaries and security guards and have exhibitions and educators and all that good stuff. So they were really in kind of this rock and a hard place, both from an information standpoint and from a financial standpoint. So, foolishly, probably they decided, all right, we're going to go for it, right? We're going to do our own. And so that was the first couple of years that I was at Moving Image, was sort of this interesting trying to do both things. So working on cataloging and digitization and figuring out what do those standards look like for a museum. But then also working, so Seth Kaufman was the developer. So working with Seth on developing this application. So, working on designs and workflows, learning what QA testing was. We had interns come in who were testing the system out. And so, it would be, they'd catalog for a week and then they would try to enter everything into this kind of beta system. And then I'd go back to Seth and say, okay, we need to add this and we need to change that. And gee, I wish that could be a drop down. And so it was this really sort of interesting, a little bit of a fly by the seat of our pants, iterative process to try and sort of come up with this application that would be useful for Moving Image, but then also, it was really always intended to be an open source application. So hoping that whatever it was that we were coming up with would also then be helpful for lots of other museums, at some point. As we moved along. So that went on for a couple of years. And then in 2007, we were invited by the Mellon Foundation to apply for a competitive grant, which the Mellon doesn't have very many competitive grants, right? Usually, like, they call you. But they had a small program that doesn't exist anymore called Research and Information Technology. And they decided they were going to do a competitive grant to try and see if they could identify some, interesting projects outside sort of like the normal folks that Mellon funded. And so we submitted to this grant and we won this competitive grant. And then that sort of got the attention of Mellon in general. And they came back to us and said, this is great. We like what you're doing. At that point, the application had been released formally. It was called Open Collection. It was, in use by, some number of museums. And then they said, what if we gave you more money, basically, like a lot more money, and you really turned this into something bigger than just this sort of shoestring thing that you've been working on. So we turned that around into a big grant application. And we partnered with the University of California at Berkeley and the University of Toronto, who was working on a sort of different Mellon funded thing. And then what came out of that grant was what is now Collection Space. So that was also a really interesting turning point, I think, because, we really wanted the project to be housed at Moving Image rather than at a university. The universities had museums, of course, but we felt like if it was at a university, it would sort of only ever be a university project. So we really wanted it to stay at Moving Image, but that was also really hard because then again, it sort of turned us into people who were worried about software and software development and release cycles and quality assurance and all this stuff. And so trying to do both of those jobs for a long time was of course sort of interesting and difficult. Um, Again, a lot of on the job learning in terms of like how to manage a giant software development project while also being a collections manager and a registrar, and all of those things. Um,
Can I jump in with a
so
quick question?
please,
When
yeah,
you started at Museum of Moving Image, you said they had an access database when you started there?
yeah.
And how did that transfer process go? Because I assume you must have moved everything from Access into what became Open Collection, right?
Yeah. So the good thing there was that Seth, who was the developer of Open Collection, had actually set up the Access database. So he knew pretty well the data model that was sort of underlying it. The Access database had been set up to manage a wall-to-wall inventory. And so it was a pretty limited field set. Obviously, we have all seen Access databases at other museums that are massive. I remember visiting the Morgan Library, which was at one time run like entirely on an Access database and just being sort of gobsmacked by, wow, you get a lot in this Access database. Ours was very small. So it was really just, I found this thing on this shelf on this day. Here's what I think it is. So that was good. So right, so first we migrated into Open Collection, and then once the first production version of Collection Space was released, then we migrated into Collection Space. So two migrations in the 10 years um, that I was there. Um, so
I- I'll jump into
yeah,
one other question too.
yeah, please.
I just don't know. One theme that we've heard a lot is sort of pushback from curators about changing systems, being told to use a particular system, right? How was the curatorial environment there? You're doing a lot of innovative work, right? What was the response?
So I think that Moving Image is probably organized differently than an art museum. So we did not get curatorial pushback. So they were, it's a really small staff again it's in that sort of funny middle zone. So when I was there, the full-time professional staff was fewer than 50 people. So I literally sat back to back with the curator. So it's not like collections management is in one place and curatorial had their offices, in some complete other zone. So curatorial, so they were actually, and there were, different people in the position over the years, were actually involved in the sort of design and development process. So I think that, they were also coming from non-traditional backgrounds. So these are not people with art history PhDs, right? These were film scholars. So they didn't have that sort of built up, oh, I've only ever used TMS, that's how museums are supposed to work sort of thing. Like they hadn't worked in museums either. So we were all sort of coming into this, a little blind, naive, whatever you want to say, in terms of, what is the art world supposed to do? And instead we thought, here are these objects. I mean, it was this very sort of object led development process. Here's this collection that we have. We have this film camera and it was owned by Carl Akeley. He's the guy that did all the dioramas at the Museum of Natural History in New York. And here's the camera he took with him on safari. And so, that is sort of what we led with when we thought about the system, is, here is this object that has all of these fascinating relationships and stories to tell. And so how do we develop a system since, here we are, like it's ours and we can do what we want. How do we develop a system that sort of leads from that, rather than coming at it from a different direction in terms of like provenance research or sort of formal art history provenance research or loans or anything like that. It was really in the beginning really really object centric and really really relationship centric, again because of this sort of funny situation of Moving Image and their collection of their collection of relationships, honestly.
It sounds like you had the opportunity to follow sort of a spirit of innovation, unchained by how it worked elsewhere, right?
Because none of us knew. None of us had ever worked at other museums, and we had no idea how it worked elsewhere. So, I mean, even the director of Moving Image, I mean, the director, it was he was college roommates with the existing director's son, and she like hired him out of college. And then, now he's the director of the museum. Same thing. The chief curator started as an educator there in 1985, and, grew into being the chief curator. So honestly, it was a museum full of people who had never worked in a museum or had never worked at any other museum. So, liberating. Thinking about it now, though, I mean, I also see the awful mistakes that we made in the early days, and I think like, oh my gosh, we spent so much time on the dumbest stuff with collection space. I think about some of the features that we sort of agonized over, like, oh, if we could just get this in there, and we, spent weeks and months on certain things. And I think about it now, and I'm like, wow, that should not have been a priority. But maybe somebody with more experience would have walked in and said, like, you might want to turn your eye this way instead.
Well, no, that's fantastic, and I just want to apologize for jumping in and derailing your story, because I know you were about
No,
to head
no.
to a collection space, and because I'm of course dying of curiosity to hear about museums using open source software and your perspectives on that.
Yeah, and and I think that has over the years, certainly when we started, it wasn't open source made people like a little nervous when we started. But honestly, when we first started, the biggest non-starter was that collection space was web-based. And people were really, really not ready to put their collections management system like on the internet, which is when they heard web-based, they heard our collections management system is going to be on the internet for anybody. Anybody's going to be able to come in and see our valuations and our anonymous donors. And, so honestly, that was a much bigger sort of sticking point. So when we really started, looking around for, when we got to a place first with open collection and then later with collection space, looking for people to jump in and work on it with us. I think open collection, which is now called collective access, was successful in finding basically smaller organizations, right? So they have a really big user base of smaller organizations where there, I think, is sort of less of that entrenched fear of things being web-based. It's, oh, I have this cool costume collection, a small university research collection of costumes, or it's a small local historical society, where they just don't have that same feeling of, wow, if we put this on the internet, it's not going to end well for us. And so they were really successful with that. We also diverged, with things like programming languages that we chose, and we were pretty heavily influenced, I think, by our university partners in that. And that has honestly been sort of a limiting factor for us, in terms of collection space being open source, but having a hard time finding development resources in our community, right? Museums are not full of Java developers. Universities aren't really full of Java developers either. So even that, but that was one thing where, open source, I think, we did a research study 3 years ago now, just trying to gauge people's, interest in different elements of community-based software and open source software. And even as recently as 3 years ago, open source was definitely a nice to have for people, but not a must have at all. So it was something that, if something happened to be open source, then people would be sort of happy for that. But it wasn't something that would be like sort of making or breaking somebody's decision about whether to go with a collections management system. Lots of folks, don't have the resources to stand up applications on their own. And so I think there's still sort of the nervousness about web-based applications, but then also just a sort of lack of IT support within an institution to stand up and sort of manage a web-based application of the size of collection space, not something small. Um, yeah.
So where do you want to go next? Do you want to talk about the move to Lyrasis, or?
Sure, sure. So I'm trying to remember when it was. It would have been in 2011. So really right when we were starting to have like production releases of collection space. So I'd been, serving as both the collections manager for Moving Image and then also the program manager for the software development part of it. Um, and then it really just got to the point where, again, because of this sort of, people in museums don't really have the ability to, install and run collection space on their own. We started looking around for an organizational home that could help people, because Moving Image was not going to be that, right? It's like we were never going to be the help desk for collection space. And so it just got to that point where, okay, now we're in production. Now people are using it. Now people are asking questions. Now people are asking who can help them. And so, we need to have a better answer than like, here's a wiki, some documentation on it. Feel free to follow along. So we were funded at about the same time as Archive Space. We have no connection with them other than the fact that we were funded by the same Mellon program at the same time. And we have similar sounding names. But they had also just decided to make the leap from their home. So they were a collaboration among, and I'm going to forget the third one. It was NYU and UCSD and a third one. And they had just made the decision to move from there to also to, like a nonprofit organizational home. And they had gone with Lyrasis. And so honestly, that was sort of the first place we looked, and we were like, oh, well, Archive Space went there, and Lyrasis is interested in, in taking on these kinds of projects. We did have interesting meetings among Archive Space and Collection Space, and then what at the time was called Project Olay, which was an open source ILS. And so we'd had interesting conversations among the three of us, sort of, again, we were all funded at the same time by the same Mellon program. And so there was this, 6 to 12 month period, like, could we be doing this all together? Like, could this somehow not be the same system, but could we share the same something, the same services, the same database layer, the same authority, was there something that we could do? And honestly, in the end, it just turned into, each community was so different, and we were all moving on sort of such different paths at such different speeds. And our communities had such different needs that it was like, well, we'll keep in touch, but we'll remain friends, all of us. But we did have a couple of meetings all together, where we had very long and interesting conversations, but it was really just sort of determined like, I think we all kind of need to go our own way. But then that being said, we saw that Archive Space had gone over to Lyrasis, and thought that would be, good for us as well. So again, it's a whole long series of meetings, really just trying to understand, how do we set up this community so that it continues to be museum led, so that it continues to be community supported software, but then it has that stability of like an organization behind it, who's sort of there, like providing, everything from like HR to development resources to, and then obviously the ability to host and provide support to people who want to use collection space was really critical for us. In the end, Archive Space went with a membership model in terms of like long-term financial sustainability. So people pay money and they become members of Archive Space, and then that pays, like the salaries of the Archive Space program staff. And then, that's how they sort of fund ongoing development. ArchiveSpace was really successful with that, and so then when we went over to Lyrasis was like, "You guys should also do a membership model. Like, look how successful ArchiveSpace was." And so we said, "Okay." And we tried that for a couple of years, and it really failed. Really did not work in the museum community to tell people, "Hey, what if you pay me a couple $1,000 and I give you nothing for it?" Like, you don't get the software. I don't provide support and services for you. It's just you're just doing this out of the kindness of your heart so that we can then continue to support this, software that you may or may not use. Um, and so it really didn't work. It was you know, I can say this because none of the people who worked at Lyrasis when that decision was made are there anymore. We're all gone. And so it's fine, but just it sort of was this kind of fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between like the archives community and the museum community, and then also the market, like for archival management software versus collections management software. Like ArchiveSpace doesn't have a lot of competitors. So in terms of, people being ready to like sign on to ASpace, they also had a really big install base that was formed from two existing applications, Archivist Toolkit and Archon, that had an install base of like 1,000. So it was this really, really different, but they sort of didn't see it, right? They saw, okay, well, how different are archives and museums, right? They understand it, so we're just going to sort of cut and paste this model onto museums, and it really didn't work. And so we've spent the last few years really kind of retooling the long-term sustainability plan for collection space, in order to, adapt to the reality of what museums are, that it takes 3 years, for example, really to choose to move to a new CMS, right? This is not a decision that somebody just wakes up on Monday morning and is like, what we need now? It's a brand new CMS, right? It's this really long, involved process with we talk about curatorial pushback, right? I mean, everybody's nervous. Everybody's workflows are so tied up with their collections management system that the idea of changing it is, it's like buying a new house. It's not, you don't just, kind of decide it quickly. And then also, again, understanding the things that people in our field value and will pay money for, which is much more tangible, right? People want to pay money for services and software. They don't want to pay money for this sort of notion of open source happiness. And or they didn't for collection space. I mean, I probably shouldn't tar every project with our same brush. It could also just be they were like, well, we don't want to support CSpace. But so that's been really interesting. And so since we have sort of pivoted away from that membership model, we've been much more successful, of course, in explaining to people what we do, and in terms of our long-term financial sustainability. So that's nice.
Megan, I was just thinking that there are some interesting parallels there to the early history of the Museum Computer Network, right? Because so much of their model in the 1970s, which ended up not working, was trying to do a membership subscription type model, right, Kathy? And then they found out that just wasn't going to work.
It was a subscription to use the software, and so it was an annual subscription, yeah. But because of developments in or evolution of that particular database, software, whatever, it wasn't viable for MCN to continue being a provider. So it changed its model to being a professional organization with an annual membership fee.
With an annual membership fee, and which I know, and it's been really interesting, I think, because because collection space, our early roots were with some academic museums. I mean, that's definitely been where we've seen a lot of strength in terms of who's implementing CSpace. And in that world, membership fatigue is very real. And so I think we were seeing that, quite a bit, where everybody's like, well, I'm already paying, X amount for all of these e-resources, and I'm paying for all of these other, open source communities that have membership fees. And so, again, the idea that at the end of the day, what people need is software that works. And so, it's not something that you can just, it's not a feel good thing that you're implementing, right? It's like, this is your daily life if you are a museum registrar or a collections manager. It can't just half work. You can't implement vaporware. You can't implement a roadmap. And so I think that again, thinking back to sort of those early conversations with lyricists, where because the archival community knew that Archon and Archivist Toolkit were going away, and that archive space would be the only option, they were like, yes, we will put money down on the roadmap because we know that this is going to be our only option. And so I think that they were imagining that we were in a sort of a similar position. And then we showed up and said, no, no, we have massive proprietary competition. We have, really long implementation cycle. So it took a little while, but that's definitely come around. And I think that, now we're in this really great position where, we have the security of lyricists, but I think, because we are open source, I mean, I guess I say that I've never worked for a proprietary vendor, so maybe they act like this too. But I do think that our community is really close knit. And I think in terms of, how we put together the roadmap and how we fund the application and what gets developed, that's 100% community based. Again, I'm never waking up on a Monday morning and thinking like, what I think we really need to add to C-Space. So it's really coming from, conversations with implementers and conversations with people who are in museums. And you really see the areas, I think, that the proprietary systems have neglected over the years for whatever reason, because there wasn't enough demand for it, or because it just wasn't their niche, or whatever it was. But I think that provides us a place all of a sudden to come in, where people are more interested now in sharing data, and integrating with other platforms and things like that, where in open source, all of a sudden they're saying like, oh, okay, we sort of get what the advantage of open source is now.
There's a philosophical shift happening there too as well, right? This the willingness to share data, which
right
20 years ago we didn't have quite so much.
No, I mean, I know, I think about my first MCN. Oh, I think change my speakers here.
While you're changing your speakers, I'll clarify my comment. Not that people weren't willing to share data 20 years ago, but that the ways of doing it weren't so easy as they are now. And there's a philosophical shift that goes along with that.
No, absolutely. I remember my first MCN, and the Boston MFA, somebody from the Boston MFA did a presentation about how they were putting like everything online, and how everybody, people were looking sort of horrified, with this, like, but everything though, like really everything. And I said, no, really everything, we're putting 300,000 records up online. And if they're not great, they're not great. But, here we are, we're going to do it. So this would have been what, 2005 or something. And it was still sort of this.
And we just heard that story from Sam Quigley. So this is
well, I was very struck by that then. And so that's exactly it, that, the idea, right, of the collections management system as a black box, hopefully the time has sort of passed. And I think that people are much more willing to, think about how to get things in and out, and how to share. And, you look at all the stuff. I know I saw Jane Alexander on your list, and all the sort of amazing stuff they've done in Cleveland. Yeah, it's definitely a change.
We also chatted briefly last week with Seb Chan and talked about his collections API work, right? At Cooper Hewitt, when you just not just make everything available, let people do whatever they want to the data.
Right. They put them on GitHub. Yeah, which is, well, especially for a Smithsonian museum, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I like to imagine that's where my tax money is going, not to any of the other stuff out there, but right, it should be free. We pay for it. Should be free out there. So, yeah, so it's, so it'll be really, so we, it's interesting to think about what's next. It's to see sort of where, where people are sort of putting their time and attention. I think that we're seeing more people wanting to share things with groups, whatever those groups might be. So museums like me, or museums in my area, or, museums that collect similar things to me. Which I know that's an idea that comes and goes every 10 years, right? We're going to have one big museum collection where we're all going to share everything. But we see it coming around now. And then also we're seeing, and I think, again, this is a place where hopefully open source has a role to play. I think that, at MCN, certainly in the last couple of years, and just out in the universe, the idea that right now, most systems are asking us to describe our materials from a very Western art historical perspective. And there are, of course, lots of different ways to describe things. And so I think where we are seeing a lot of interest is people wanting to incorporate, traditional and indigenous knowledge management into a system where it can sort of live side by side with, well, I do need to know that it's 8 by 10. I still need to have a place where I can put that part. But I also then, want my collections management system to sort of acknowledge that just because I've taken this thing into the museum doesn't mean that it's dead now. That these things have lives. This is one part of their journey, is their time here in the museum. And then, thinking about the system as a way to capture really the life of that object from, its creator and their story and how it came to the museum and where it might be after. And so I think we're seeing that in a lot of different communities, this idea of sort of traditional knowledge management. And how do we incorporate more of that and support more of that, in our systems, so that it's not just this, okay, well, here are the categories for descriptions of works of art, and those are the fields that are important. And, that's what we're going to capture about our materials. So that's something that we've been doing a lot of work and thinking around, and that has been really exciting. And again, I think, that's something that's so community led for us. So, we have implementers who have recently suggested within our name authority that we add a new section where, if you are a creator, what do you say that you are? Here, again, I have whatever your ULAN record is. But like, who do you say you are? Where do you say that you are from? Or what is your gender? Or what is your, how are you expressing information about yourself? Are we allowed to share that? Are we allowed to, so that instead of, again, an artist being sort of pinned to the wall, we're inviting them into the collections management system to say, well, you tell us, who you are and how you would like us to express that information about you. So that's something that we've been working on with some folks at the Oakland Museum of California. So I think that is where, a lot of the really exciting stuff for us is happening now, with this idea that, how do we use this platform that we've developed and this community that we've developed to really kind of turn a lot of what we have done on its head to a certain extent, and think about how we can kind of change things up and expand, sort of these traditional notions of authority. So that's exciting. That's some of the exciting stuff that's happening.
And it's a great example. I love that example a lot. It's I think a lot of people don't realize how hard work that is to break away from those traditional name authorities. Shoot, we're doing this here at the university just with respect to giving the students the ability to specify preferred names in like things like Canvas or our database systems. You're fighting against years of institutional
Yeah, I mean, well,
I
and
don't
that's,
know what the word I mean, but you know what I mean. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. It's, well, if the Library of Congress says, that your name is Paul Marty, but then you tell me it's something different. You want me to call you something like, okay, well, like which one wins? Like when I make a label, like, and how do I, and then of course on our, on our side, we've got our data people being like, wait, so they're going to have two names, like a synonym or like a, and so it's so interesting from like a philosophical standpoint. Why are we capturing this? And what do we need to capture? And then from a technical standpoint, how do I make sure that the way that you want to be represented is the way, but then also we maintain the older style because, again, we just kind of have, we feel like we have to. Um, we can't really imagine a collections management system without like a classification scheme or, dimensions and, all these sort of useful things. So it is this really fascinating and interesting. How do we make those two sort of work together? How do we ensure that neither feels lesser, right? That like, oh, well, we're going to put this indigenous knowledge over in a little corner, but it's not like the real stuff, right? So, how do we make sure that it doesn't become this, that it really is sort of fully integrated in and part of, and again, so for us, that all just completely comes from what we hear from what people are doing, and sort of the needs. So like with Oakland, this came directly out of, we're working with these artists and they want to tell us this stuff. And so help us figure out how to put it in such a way that, it's useful.
That's a great example, a great story. We're coming up on the hour here, so we'll be careful of your time. And what else? Is there some other stories that you wanted to share with us?
No, I'm trying to think. I feel like the first one was always the best one.
Oh, very good.
The sticky note and the grant application, right? I don't know. I mean, was there anything else? Like any other? I'm trying to think.
I was sort of taken with trying to catalog the action figure, but
Yeah, that was, again, for someone who'd never worked in a museum and had never, it was definitely a sort of trial by fire in terms of trying to figure out how to model like how all the names change over time and how, even for one figure, we'll pick on Star Wars action figures, right? They released them when the first movie came out, and then they changed the name of the first movie when the second movie came out. And so, you have to look at the package because even though Luke looks the same, he's not the same one, right? And so it's really fascinating, and you get tangled up, right, in fandom. And, we had a very, he's actually a professor, actually a professor now. I won't call him out, but he is a professor now. He was a big fan of a lot of the materials that we had in the collection. And so that was, it wasn't Paul.
well, I was thinking of all the changes in the Avengers series too, and what that might mean to a cataloging system.
And it's like, it's so, or, right. So, you need to know. So it's like, I need to know that this is the Luke from A New Hope, because the licensing was different then, right? Warner Brothers owned the licensing, and then Lucas took over in the second film. And then that's when they started calling it Episode 4. And, it's like really trying to develop an application that was able to tell just right that one example. And Luke is always the example that I use of like, well, why couldn't you just use Past Perfect? Or why couldn't you just use TMS? And it was, let me tell you why. Here's this one little guy, but times, they have 100,000 objects in the collection. So here's this one little guy and his one little story, but then you multiply it times all of the things that they had in the collection. And it really just became, we see why they felt like, this is going to be the easier path. Of course, it was not easier.